Thank you very much for coming to this second session of the Battle of Ideas today. As you will already know, this session is in the tech dilemmas strand. In the spirit of the battle, we want to hear from everyone who has something to say, and we want to have as many conversations as we can between you and the panel today. So I'm going to start. My name's Sally Taplin. I'm a business consultant. I work with the MBA group at Bayes Business School, and I'm also on Debating Matters as a chair, working with sixth formers to encourage debate. My motto is that really of the Royal Society, which is don't take anyone's word for it. Decide for yourself what you think and use these opportunities to get to that perspective. And also, don't be afraid about changing your mind if you really think it's important. I have a really great panel here for the discussion that we have today. As the second session in the Tech Dilemma strand, what we're talking about today in title is the internet versus the nation state. What next? Is it in the Wild West of borders? And how we think about the power of big tech. Technology has always been something that's impacted our world. It is the fruits of human ingenuity and tools to create and move on the world around us. There are many people who think perhaps it's gone too far, or at least the people behind it have gone too far with how they're using it. And what we want to look at today is, has that happened? Has the power of big tech got to a point where it threatens our freedoms, threatens our democratic freedoms and rights, or is it a bigger enabler than that? And how can we hold them to account if they have gone too far? And there are many different topics that sit within that, which you'll see in the blurb for the session. What I want to do is very much to get into that session as quickly as possible. So I'm going to introduce you to our incredible panel today, who all come from very different perspectives and have a lot of different experience and ideas to offer and to stimulate your discussion on this subject. So I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. First, Timandra Harkness, to my right here, a journalist, writer and broadcaster. She's a presenter on Radio 4's FutureProofing and has done a really excellent series, actually, of recordings and discussions on how to disagree, which I think in the spirit of the battle, and if anyone was in the session before us in the main hall heard, disagreement is good. We don't need to get to an agreement or consensus on any of this stuff. We just need to know how to really have a good conversation about it and see where that gets us. She's also the author of Big Data, Does Size Matter? And describes herself, I think, variously as a lapsed comedian. And I'd say that, you know, even if Timandra's not on the circuit, you can take the woman off the circuit, but you can't take the humour out of the woman. And I think we'll enjoy that as much as we will her excellent ideas and discussion today. Speaking second is next to Timandra, Dr. Keith Teare. Keith has flown over from California to join us. Thank you, Keith, for coming. The CEO of Signal Rank Corporation, Silicon Valley-based serial entrepreneur, who is an innovator in his own right, having, for those people who will remember internet cafes, having set up Siberia back in the day when the internet was in its first fires, EasyNet and Real Names, and is an investor in many other technology firms that are changing the way we work and interact. So thank you for coming to join us, Keith. After Keith, we'll hear from Graham Smith, who's a tech and internet lawyer of counsel at Bird & Bird, an author of what's been defined as the book on internet law and regulation, a blogger and, as he describes himself, a cyber legal, going into areas of copyright disputes, surveillance legislation, and has been described as the doyen of the area. Thank you for joining us, Graham. And then speaking last but not least is Andrew Orlowski, business columnist at the Daily Telegraph. Used to be the editor of The Register. Almost, okay. You can tell us more about that. Founder of Think of X and assistant producer of All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace. I think, Andrew, you coined the term Google washing
Yes.
in the early noughties, which was to do with how Google dealt with information and decided how to present it or not. So we have a really excellent panel of people who will have a lot to say and a lot to stimulate the debate over big tech. So I'm going to ask, with no more delay, Timandra to start. Each of our speakers have 5 minutes, as you know, and then we're going to come straight out to you to get your thoughts and questions and comments. Timandra, please take it away.
Thank you. I'm in very auspicious company here, I must say. When I first looked at the question, if you like, internet versus the nation state, I'm somebody who's often very critical of the way big tech-driven corporations operate and the way that our data is generally collected in a quite opaque way. And if you like, the asymmetry of power there between big corporations that collect a lot of aggregated data from all of us and we who gaily go about our way with our phones in our hands, assuming that the world is designed around us, whereas in reality, if we think about it for a second, we'll know that we are being filtered for the purposes of others, both corporations and increasingly of governments. So, you know, I come with a mind that is both excited about the potential of technology, but also quite wary about the way it's used and who gets to use it at the moment. But on the other hand, I'm also quite skeptical often about governments which are supposedly democratically elected and accountable to us, but in practice, I think we could probably all look at examples from now and the recent past where governments don't necessarily seem to be acting in our interest or on our behalf, but often seem to be seeing us as a problem to be managed. But when I thought about it, I thought, in a way, I think it's a mistake to see nation states and the internet as two opposed things. I think that in many ways, not only are they very similar in the sense that both corporations which have relationships with a great many of us through our data and governments which have relationships with a great many of us increasingly through our data, in some ways have a similar problem, which is that how do you actually have relationships with masses and masses of people? And that often the answer to that is that the masses of people are something to be managed, to be observed, studied, perhaps predicted, perhaps nudged, perhaps controlled. And that in some ways, when I look at things that I think ought to be regulated or controlled or at least made transparent about the way tech corporations work, and I think, well, this is something that should be subject to democratic control and governments should be doing this on our behalf. But then I look at governments and think, well, this is strange and unsatisfactory. The government that I would like to be saying, well, look, tech corporations, you provide a valuable service and it's still very exciting, but we'd just like to make sure that this is happening in the interests of the people who elected us and that there are safeguards here, that the governments instead seem to look at the corporations and go, we see what you're doing here. This is brilliant. This is fantastic. We have these masses of people who elected us, but we have no idea anymore who they are or what they think or what they want or why they do what they do or what they're going to do next. And yet you seem to have cracked this by having this great one-to-one relationship with all these people and being very intimate in their lives and their thoughts and their behaviour and even predicting their behaviour and even suggesting to them that they might behave in other ways. So in many ways, I think the nation state, which should perhaps be doing other things, certainly in my mind, is in fact borrowing a lot of the way it operates from the internet. And the internet, which, you know, we can argue about how it started out. Did it start out as basically a product of the Cold War with the American military research saying, if we get hit by nuclear war, how can we make sure that we could keep information flowing? This is one origin story of the internet, that They went, if we have a decentralized system, then even if the Russians take out a couple of centers, we can still carry on. And of course, the other origin story is that there's a load of anarchists in California and hippies who went, we can have a decentralized, truly bottom-up democratic system of communication where anybody can be anything and do anything, and we can communicate with each other. We don't have to go through the man. And arguably, I think both these things are possibly true. But I think today, the internet is very dominated by large corporations. They are what makes it happen. They are what facilitate our access to it. And I think the nation state, which perhaps should be operating on a different model and should be saying, we are a democracy and this is how we work. We exert political power on behalf of the demos, are in fact looking at the internet and going, this is really good. We basically now exist to provide a service, and we want to have an individual relationship with each one of our citizens because we have no idea who you are or who we represent. And so we can imitate the internet. And I think I'll just finish by saying, if we think about public space now is in effect mostly online, which means in effect that it's privately provided because it's provided by different corporations who provide different platforms. But then if you look at public space in the physical world, it's often privatized. And if it's not privatized, it's treated as if it's private. It's regulated as if the existence of a physical public space was a service that we get to use if we behave ourselves right. And so I think I would like to see the internet versus the nation state being a bit more perhaps of a difference. I'll finish on that. I would like them to be more different from each other.
Interesting. Maybe they're closer together than we're originally imagining. Let's see. Keith, your views, please.
So obviously everybody looks at every problem from the point of view of their own experience. And my experience since I was 40 years old has been being an architect of the internet. And I'm profoundly anti-British, even though I'm British. My first memory of the Union Jack was throwing smoke bombs at National Front protesters in North London whilst I was a student. So I'm no friend of nation states particularly. And I've traveled all over the world and I don't live in England anymore. And, my bias is I love globalism. I am an internationalist and I don't like small Englishness. I love England. I love Scarborough where I was born. So I don't not like England, but I don't like nationalism. And nation states, it seems to me, are a catalyst for small thinking, not big thinking, whereas the internet is a canvas for big thinking. And so I want to declare that bias up front so you can attack me with knowledge when you attack me later. So let's just start a little bit with globalization. I think there's two kinds of globalization, top down and bottoms up. The EU is a good example of top-down globalization. It's basically imposed bureaucracy from above. There's no democracy. No one gets to make decisions. It's alien. It's separate. That to me is not globalization. That is basically the establishment in a region organizing itself collectively from the top down to through political parties and other institutions to dominate organizations and people. Bottoms-up globalization is completely different. The internet's a great example of it. The technology was invented in the United States, it so happens, in the military sector of the United States, as it so happens. And by the 1990s, it was open sourced and made available to everyone in the world. And by the late 90s, everyone in the world could send messages to each other. I don't think of big tech actually as the best embodiment of the internet. I think of email as a way better example of the internet. I think instant messaging is a great example of the internet. I think file sharing is a great example of the internet. I think streaming video of Chinese movies with subtitles is a great example of the internet. The internet is a technology that has companies sitting on top of it, but they're not the same thing. The internet itself is a wonderful, global, hard to stop technology. I spent a lot of time in China, and in China, everyone uses VPNs. And they can quite successfully get around what's known as the Great Wall, the firewall that's meant to stop them reading things. It doesn't work because the internet routes around it. And so the internet really is something that makes the world smaller, in the same way that airplanes do, and makes it better for us humans to know and understand each other across the whole world. So to me, that's bottoms-up globalization. Blockchain's another great example of that. Countries try to stop the internet. They also try to stop the movement of money to digital forms and routing around the pound and the dollar. In the recent few weeks, when the dollar has been very strong and the pound and other currencies have declined, smart people bought Bitcoin, which didn't lose its value. And you know, that will be a trend that governments will not be able to stop. Nation states will be too small to control human beings moving wealth around the world, using the technology that has globalized things. Revolut here, if you don't use it, do. You know, you can turn any currency into any other currency, including cryptocurrency, like this, for free, and send it to a friend across the world, and no one stops you. It's a wonderful thing. So I'm a great fan of the internet. I'm no fan of the nation state. And I think I'm going to lose this debate, but who cares?
Thank you, great contribution. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the internet being different from big tech and having a sort of bottom-up enabling force for people. Graham, it'd be lovely to hear from you.
Thank you. So firstly, I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I'm billed as being from a law firm, which I am, but these are my personal opinions, not to be attributed to law firm or clients. I haven't got that out of the way. The blurb really frames this, as you've heard, as the internet versus big tech. But I think there is a third pillar, which in many ways I would suggest is more important and is routinely minimized or left out of these discussions. And that is the individual user of the internet. If we think about what is the feature of the internet that marks it out from any previous medium, it's the ability of individuals to publish and to converse across borders. It is Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights personified. That was written back in 1949, and it talked about the right of people to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. Now that could have been written for the internet. And the internet is about individuals and organizations who make use of the internet to converse, publish, and do business. The internet really is nothing without its users. And I mean, to give you an example, as you've heard, I write a blog. It's called Cyber Legal. Thanks to the stats that Google Blogger provide me with, I can see that it's, I was going to say read, at least accessed, I hope read, in at least 60 to 70 different countries around the world. And although I'm based in the UK, the blog is based, I write it from the UK. Actually, the biggest readership or biggest access isn't from the UK, it's from another country. So because my blog can be seen, because it's visible in all those countries, does that mean that I have to comply with the laws of every country in which it can be read? Or do I have to comply with only the UK laws? Or is it something else, something in between? And you might say, well, does that matter? Are you really going to be prosecuted under the laws of whatever, country X, if I do something that's contrary to the laws of that country? I think it does matter. It matters a lot because laws are enforced across borders. There are, you can go back to 2000, the dawn of the internet, well, it wasn't the dawn of the internet, it was around for much longer than that, but many people's idea of the dawn of the internet, the dot-com boom, when in France, civil proceedings and a criminal prosecution were brought because Yahoo, on its US website, was allowing users to post and to buy and sell Nazi memorabilia, which was contrary to perfectly legal in the US, but contrary to the laws of France. And the view of the French, and indeed ultimately the French court on this, was that because that was accessible in France, it wasn't geo-blocked or anything like that, that contravened French laws. And it's not the only example. I was involved some years ago helping, advising a UK student at a Sheffield Metropolitan University, I think it was, who was running a site out of the UK, and the US authorities laid criminal charges in the US for criminal copyright infringement against this site, and then started extradition proceedings against this student to extradite the student to the US to face US criminal copyright charges. That case, as it happens, ultimately was resolved, but I raise it just as an example of, it doesn't matter, it's theoretical until it isn't, until it happens to someone. And if nation states are going to be assertive about applying their local laws extraterritorially to other countries, to maybe the whole world, then we need to ask what kind of behavior does that incentivize? And clearly that then incentivizes geo-blocking, geo-fencing your site, should, as cyber legal, if I had the tools to do it, should I try to prevent anyone from anywhere in the rest of the world from accessing it because I might be vulnerable to the laws of some other country? And that raises the spectre of what's often known as the splinter net. Now, people have different views. A lot of people think, well, actually, that's a good idea. You should be carving up the internet so that it's in that way. Others think not. And I've got my yellow card, so I'll just say, I think looking at this historically, in the early days, we had this cyber libertarian fantasy of the borderless internet, and even the idea that the internet could be independent of nation states. And then in the 2000s, nation states struck back, and the Great Firewall of China being a good example, but in other states as well, going for blocking orders and so on, encouraging the blocking of sites on a geographical basis. And now I think we're in the era of nation-state overreach, where nation-states are increasingly desirous of asserting the superiority of their local laws and saying that they should apply worldwide, and that either material should be taken down worldwide or that the sites should be blocked. And that's, in its way, very reminiscent of the jamming of foreign broadcasts in the days of the Soviet Empire. And I suppose the question I would ask at the end is, do we want to create borders in cyberspace is one thing, but do we want to create what are in effect Berlin walls in cyberspace and prevent people from accessing any information that may have been created under the laws of another country? And I would suggest you don't have to be a Californian anarchist to think that that isn't necessarily a good idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. And to summarise, Andrew.
Thanks very much for having me, everyone, and for coming when there's so many interesting panels happening at the same time. I'm going to start with a question for the audience. Who's batted away a cookie as you were browsing the web this week? A cookie consent pop-up? Anyone? A lot of hands go up. Yeah, I batted away 17 yesterday. I don't normally count. And I batted away 8 on Thursday, but then I was on the phone for most of Thursday. Did it make you feel more assured as you were browsing the web? Did it make you feel more in control? Did it make you feel like a fully autonomous grown-up? Did it make you want to thank the wise bureaucrats, lawyers, and officials who have made that mandatory? The cookie consent pop-up really plays the same role as recycling does in our lives. It's a futile activity designed to make a very heavy-handed ideological point. It's designed to make you neurotic and anxious because it was designed by neurotic and anxious people. Just as we must recycle to be reminded that resources are scarce, even though they're not, it's a meaningless phrase, we must give consent site by site, even though that data, we don't know, it makes very little difference. Why does this exist? It's the result of pressure from digital activists, from producer campaigners, from lawyers, and academics who themselves have this very fragile and neurotic view of the world and of how we approach technology. 10 years ago, when the EU was revisiting privacy, they screamed for the pop-up. They said nothing else would do or protect us, and they got what they wanted. And they've defended it very stoutly for a decade. So today, this really forms a kind of digital policy blob, and this complicates the proposition. That's the title of this talk. The internet's over here, the state's over here. The blob is incoherent, I find. I've been reporting on the development of this for 20 years. And it stops us finding political solutions. It prolongs conflicts because it benefits from it. It's rather like the old anarchist joke about the police. If there was no crime, they'd have nothing to do. Now, it seems to me that in our lives, people are demanding both more autonomy and control. This is taking place all over the world. So it makes the phrase internet estate, again, quite complicated. The blob works closely with bureaucrats, and the groups are typically funded by big technology companies. The digital rights sector is really a client. Over 20 privacy groups, for example, in the UK and Europe, were funded by just one tech oligarch, Pierre Omidyar, and his foundation. But more importantly is that the dogs don't bark. There are ideas that we never get to hear. They never surface. They're never allowed to breathe. And the blob really takes its cue from technology utopianism of the 1990s. So let me explain. I was hoping I didn't have to quote this because I was absolutely betting somebody on the panel would quote John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. Graham probably alluded to it. It's very Californian, so hold on to your sick bags, right? I come from cyberspace, new home of mind. Mind's got a capital M there. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past, that's everyone who isn't on the internet, you are not welcome amongst us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. Now, I find it very appropriate that those words were composed at Davos at an early World Economic Forum in 1995. You will own nothing, not even, especially not your own personal data. Barlow was very weirdly prescriptive of what rights you may or may not exercise. He decided that in advance. So this was born the digital rights, but rights not for you and for me, but for rights for the bits to flow freely. This is where the utopian concept of the internet comes from. It's for the bits, it's not for the people. Now, bits flowing freely means people must surrender to the bits. They're unable to draw boundaries if they wish to. So our relationship to the state and to technology is complicated. The state can transgress our boundaries, I think we all know that, but it can help enforce boundaries, and this is increasingly what a demand from conservative or populist governments is asking them to do. We've seen big tech cancel a sitting US president. This is really in response to the idea that states are overreaching. I don't see that. It was big tech could cancel a sitting president. It was big tech which cancelled stories which could have influenced the election. Big tech swings elections. Big tech defines whether you can take part in digital commerce, thanks PayPal, which cancelled people this week. So the norms are really set as much, if not more, by technology companies. Now, I've got 20 seconds left. I'm going to quote, so I'm going to throw overboard the last part of my talk, but a lot of the pushback I see from social conservatives who are being elected is often a pushback to the idea that biology itself is fluid, and bodies are fluid, and human nature is fluid. I'll quote somebody who's probably more connected to the tech elites than anyone else, the pop star Grimes, who in her song We Appreciate Power sang that biology is superficial, intelligence is artificial, simulation, it's the future. Just wrapping up, I think what this is pushed back very strongly by the writer Mary Harrington, who calls this meat space Lego. If the tech giants can rearrange our information, they're going to rearrange us. That taps into, and I think Italy's new president, Giorgia Meloni, fascinating talk she's given, draw on what I call conspiratorial energy. So if I've got one kind of final point is, in response to the loss of sovereignty, I want to see some of that energy go from conspiracy theories to direct political engagement with technology companies and the state.
Thank you very much. Let's give a little hand to the speakers. And I got the opportunity to use these red and yellow cards, which I really enjoy. In my other life, I'm also involved in football, so being able to use these is great. So I'm going to come out to the audience.
So something I'd be interested to hear discussed a bit more would be the concepts of the metaverse and the sort of digital nation state. So I think today, personally, I live about 5 minutes from here, but I work for a foreign company with colleagues all over the world. I never go shopping. I order everything online. A lot of my money is in cryptocurrencies, not in the pound. Personally, I actually feel I live more in the internet, and I think that's a social movement that will continue to happen. Some people in the past may have opted out, for example, of their local government and moved somewhere else to a different nation state. I think in the future we might want to opt out of your local government and move to a digital nation state where you get most of the services that you today expect from your local government, including political representation, maybe water, food, security, other things, education definitely, from the internet instead of from wherever you happen to live. And so that's, I think, something which hasn't really been touched on, but would be really interesting to hear from the panelists.
Yeah, just probably approaching it from the other perspective. I think from a practical point of view, a lot of people are uneasy about particularly about the taxation, which a lot of big tech firms do not appear to pay. And I think that's a big, it's a big social issue there. I think, that's something that resonates. I think it is important that, that there's that sense of fairness and, with what the nation state does have to provide. So I think that's an issue to explore.
Thank you.
A couple of points. First of all, the title, Internet and the Wild West. Well, we wonder, what was the Wild West like? Well, first of all, the Wild West didn't last for very long, and in it you had local people who took the law into their own hands, lynch law. But already there was a central government, a mandate, which had decided that they would eventually, and they suppressed the Wild West. They sent somebody out, for example, to shoot and killed Billy the Kid. Well, the question is, in the internet, there's plenty of lynch law. Is there anyone, any authority actually controlling it? Well, as far as I know, not yet, but there's the big companies, particularly Google, are pretty near getting a stranglehold over the internet, and this could pose very serious problems in the future, in the long-range future. I mean, if we take a nation state versus internet, which is the most dangerous for the liberty of the individual? Well, at the moment, it's the nation state, because Russia has invaded Ukraine. There's no doubt about that. And countries like Russia and Iran will cause trouble probably into about the 2050. But in the second half of the 20th century, I predict that it will be those who control the internet who will have global power and possibly want to install a sort of global government even. Zuckerberg, by the way, he said that he does want to go into politics. But I think he's a bit too old already. But somebody could arise who will control the internet and push it and really do a lot of damage.
My question to the panel is, what do you think the biggest challenges are of Web3 or the metaverse, knowing that it is not the metaverse a single thing, it is 20 plus platforms with their own version of it being pushed out, and you've got Decentraland and Sandbox, and you've got different companies who are forming this space, which will just be more bigger companies controlling the space. And what do you think the challenges are of this new evolution of the internet, and how do nation states, either individually or collectively, manage that?
I'm going to bring those questions back now so that everyone here can kind of comment on them, pick the ones that you want to talk about most. Perhaps Keith, you could start.
The John Perry Barlow reference, there's a great thing called the Clue Train Manifesto, which is the anti-John Perry Barlow, written by a guy called Doc Searles and a bunch of others. Google the Clue Train Manifesto, it's really worth reading. It's basically the liberation of the individual from being targeted by retailers and using the internet to flip around the power relationship between the seller and the buyer. It's very, very good.
I'd describe it as two cheeks of the same arse. It's just as utopian as.
But the ones I'd like to pick up on is
Web.
Web3 and the metaverse, obviously super interesting. Hands up if you've ever used an Oculus Quest face mask thing. Not very many. So I mean, firstly, I'll say I'm a total skeptic on the metaverse. I don't think human beings are going to put on a face mask and go to another world. And if they did, it wouldn't be a good thing. That said, I did buy one and tried it, and it is amazing. It is super amazing how realistic it is, and what it creates in your brain, and your ability to engage with other people is super amazing. And so then the only question is, will anyone use it? And I think the answer is no, because it's completely uncomfortable. It's completely, you could do it for 10 minutes, maybe. So I don't think it's a viable path. And I think Zuckerberg is doing it because he hates the fact that Apple and Google own the user interface to the internet. Facebook is just an app. He wants Facebook to be the device. And he knows he can't make a phone, so he's making a face mask. Unfortunately, no one's going to wear it. Web3 is not really, for me, a metaverse phenomenon, although I think it will be shoehorned in, because the metaverse is not going to evolve the way people think it is. I think Web3 is a totally different animal. What is Web3? For many people probably don't know what Web3 is. Web3 is the idea of decentralized, autonomous decision-making through software that governs transactions and relationships with democracy through something called a digital autonomous organization where the members have votes. It's basically very similar to local democracy. It's democracy of the users of a thing. There are fintech Web3 players, there are cryptocurrency Web3 players, there are governance Web3 players, yellow card. And they're all super interesting, but they're all very early and nothing's real yet.
Thanks. Timandra.
Okay, well, I'd kind of like to come back, I think, on... I'm going to try and roll in different points from the different questions, because I thought they were interesting in different ways. I think that there's a bit of an illusion that the internet can do everything that nation states can do. And I think this relates to what I was saying at the start about the fact that nation states are trying to model themselves on the internet. So when you say, I live entirely through the internet, I work through the internet, I order all my food online, and you're right to look to say, are we going to have digital nation states? I mean, Estonia is already offering a kind of digital citizenship, but you're not actually a citizen, but you kind of are, and looking towards that model of just providing a lot of the things that states do digitally, and recognizing that where you physically are may not necessarily determine where the company that you work for is based, or where you feel at home. You might come from Britain but work somewhere else completely, but still basically feel like your loyalties and your relationships that are important to you are in Britain. But I think it's very easy if you are, and certainly during lockdowns and so on, if you are, like I was, one of the people who can basically sit at home and continue to work through your computers, you think, well, this is where the real stuff is, and forget that is only possible because somebody is keeping the water flowing into your house, and keeping the electricity flowing into your house, and keeping the internet going. And we learn this very quickly when there is political unrest somewhere and the government turns off things like email and social media and the internet because they physically can. And political representation, you think, well, okay, I can fill in online surveys. I'd be really interested to learn more about this Web3 idea. I can have a voice online, and I think it is truly wonderfully democratizing that any of us can post our opinions online. We don't have to go through a newspaper editor or a television channel. But that's not political representation. Political representation is saying governments enact political power, and by having a vote, I have an iota of that power, and I have an iota of the say in who governs me and what they can do. And that's not the same as having my opinions gathered online. And I think the tax question is related to that, because the fact that corporations base themselves in places other than where things physically happen in order to get out paying tax is not actually, it's not new, and it's not unique to internet companies, not at all. Lots of companies that manufacture things base themselves in countries other than where the stuff is manufactured in order to optimize the amount of tax they have to pay. That's what a globalized economy is like. Oil companies base themselves in one country and then license the intellectual property of, I don't know, how to dig up oil, I don't know how it works, to a company in another country where stuff happens, so that's not where the tax has to be paid. And I think this reminds us that the internet in itself is not, it's, you know, the cloud is a machine in someone else's warehouse using electricity and producing heat. The stuff of the internet is physical stuff, and people, I'm getting the red card, so I'm going to shut up. But even the internet is a physical reality. And yes, it has transformed how we can communicate, but it doesn't actually let us off the laws of physics, biology, and economics.
Thanks, Timandra. Andrew, what do you think about those questions, or any that you want to focus on?
Should we do cryptocurrency, Web3, and the metaverse kind of tangled up? I made an absolute idiot of myself a year ago. This was my argument, and you can laugh away, but at that time, it looks ridiculous now, but at that time, I know people who've done really well with cryptocurrencies and DeFi, and I thought this is really, really interesting. But what was fascinating was that if the formal capital markets stop doing what they're doing, in other words, they become very woke, they stop investing in fossil fuels, which we still need, then I can see, DeFi was kind of trying to, there's a community of crypto people who are trying to create an alternative to the capital markets across various levels. I suggested, well, you know, if the real capital markets stop doing what they're doing, then this has really interesting properties in itself. Could you buy a house, use it from a loan from a crypto company, and pay it back to another crypto company? Since the crash, that looks really stupid, I'll admit. But for the optimists for cryptocurrencies, it's just a temporary lull. For the pessimists, it's just it. And I think, trying to look as objectively as I can, there's a lot of naivety and really poor programming, and a lot of this stuff was held together by string and glue and hope, and there was a lot of fraud. Complexity hides fraud. Onto Web3 and the metaverse, I think the context for this is that we've had 15 years of low interest rates, and we've had every single terrible business idea got funding. Andreessen Horowitz has got an enormous fund to pour into this. All I see is the utopianism that was there 25 years ago, and somebody's trying to recreate it. I found, now, 2015 we were discussing technology and autonomy, and I'm sorry if you were there that day and you're here today, but specifically, I quoted a friend of mine who's an author and a critic, that utopianism is a kind of escapism, that in times of historical uncertainty, people wish to create imaginary spaces into which the observers can flee from their anxieties about the cultural and historical position that we're in. Now, pretending everything's new, the internet all over again, to me it just sounds like a cargo cult. Why do you have to do this? Why not fix the things that are broken with the internet already in a way that we can all agree on and move forward? So I find that kind of part very juvenile. The metaverse itself, I didn't quote Mary Harrington, but I think she raises the point that when men's inhibitions are removed, it always ends up subprime for women. And the metaverse, you've always got these cases of bullying and atrocious behaviour. I don't think it will happen because absolutely nobody wants to be in a metaverse. I am a huge fan of virtual reality, and I think it's untapped. I mean, my advice to Facebook is get rid of the maniac who's running you at the moment. You've got an amazing games helmet, and get lots of content creators to create fantastic experiences for it.
Thank you. Graham.
Thank you. Okay, I don't think anyone's dealt with your question over here about living in the internet and opting out from local government. To me, that's exactly the question that was being debated back in the 1990s. It is the cyber libertarian vision from then. If you go back and read David Johnson and David Post's article, Law and Borders, The Rise of Law in Cyberspace, from 1996, that's exactly what was being debated then. And it didn't happen then. I don't think it will happen now, because ultimately, however powerful one may think private enterprises are, big corporations are, it's the state who can lock you up, it's the state who has the guns. And in that battle, there is only one winner. And I think, you know, whether you think it's a good fantasy or a bad fantasy, the idea of, you know, because we live in the internet, we can opt out of nation state government, I think is still a fantasy. The Wild West, this is a real bugbear of mine, actually. The idea that the internet is some kind of Wild West is something which grates with me, I have to say. And the idea that all that's out there is lynch law. I have 750,000 words here which says otherwise. This is law, this is UK law, and it's the same for every other country in the world. Now, you know, you may say there isn't one entity that controls the internet in a legal sense, because that's the argument transposed into online for, you know, one uniform world government with one set of laws. Is that what we want? Some people may say, yes, we should have one set of laws for the internet. Others may say, actually, you know, as in the offline world, there's value in having a discovery process with different nation states, with different kinds of laws, experimenting with those laws, and that that is actually a better system than trying to agree on one set of uniform laws for the world. So I do rather take issue with the Wild West thing, and I do rather take issue with the idea that it's a lawless space. I think my personal view is that one, you know, from a user perspective, one is in as much danger from the gun-toting tariff who marches into town and starts firing from the hip, when the users, again, you know, likely to get caught in the crossfire. And on metaverse, virtual reality, yeah, we had Second Life. Was it 10 years ago? We had Second Life.
Sad film, we called it.
And, you know, I think there are people who would say that, you know, the metaverse is Second Life with better graphics. I think there are some real, I'm going to say this as a lawyer, legal issues that arise as the graphics get better, as it becomes more, you know, a simulacrum of real life. You know, in online games, we kill people. If we are going into something which claims to be, you know, a reflection of real life, what happens? I mean, this has been raised already. You know, what happens if there is a rape in the metaverse? Should that be counted as something equivalent to real rape, or is it something which isn't real at all and so should be fine? I think there is going to be some really, really difficult issues of that kind if the metaverse happens.
Okay, we're now getting into some debate about what we think, and I'd really like to, in this, understand what people think in the audience about this. Where is the power lying, and who is getting trapped in the middle?
Just to make a comment that, yeah, Facebook is, or Meta, whatever you want to call it, has been seen as like a perfect example of a natural monopoly, which, for those who don't know, it means like a de facto monopoly that a company, even if there's no that has, so that they can do what they want. Essentially, but their share price has fallen, I think, by more than half since the start of the year. So they're in people have voted with their feet. I think it's mainly young people who are deserting. So it's not like they're all, people have seen them as sort of all powerful. But in 2012, it's actually Obama had used digital media to his advantage, and he had the best. That was one of the reasons he won against Romney, supposedly. I can't remember that he had a social media manager who was really good at targeting people.
Okay.
Thank you. I wanted to sort of challenge and follow up this idea about tax, because we live in a society where government itself is enormously reliant on the services that are provided by big tech companies, whether it be sort of data management, you name it. And I think if we were to sort of cut the cable on them, it would be seen more by the public, who possibly identify more with the services they provide in terms of their daily lives. Lots of us do jobs in here that are totally reliant on sort of data systems provided by Google or Microsoft. If the government was to say, well, you're not paying tax, then those companies have enormous power to affect our lives, and then for us to think it's the government in the wrong, because I think we actually live in a world where people identify more with the ecosphere of, say, Apple, Google, or Amazon than they do with their nation state.
I think the relationship between big tech and the nation state is perhaps best seen as a dialectic and an ongoing dialectic rather than some sort of fixed battle. But the role in which the metaverse is playing has got very interesting in that dialectic, because you have the Metaverse Discussion Forum that's brought 1,500 tech companies and other interested parties together to decide they have to agree to interoperability. They have to agree, in other words, to work together. And I'm glad you waved the big tomb of legal things here as well, because you also have, because of the metaverse, a very large company that owns Fortnite and Unreal Games taking Apple to court on a sort of antitrust basis. And in other words, they're sorting these problems out amongst themselves. The nation state isn't doing that. The EU is quite happy for people to evade tax by having companies in Ireland with low corporation tax, playing a sort of neoliberal game, as it were. But I think that dialectic has changed, and that the metaverse is sort of playing a funny sort of catalytic role in this. I was wondering what the panel might think of that.
Andrew.
Yeah, I'm toying with the idea that people identify more with their online service than they do with a nation state. Coming a couple of weeks after the Queen's funeral, do you think Mark Zuckerberg's going to get a 9-hour queue when he pops off? No, joking aside, I know people who are so fanatical about Apple, they've got tattoos, but I think we underestimate how deep cultural and philosophical and political and religious ties mean to people. And I don't really see people identifying with, I'm a Googler, as I'm British. I think people are much more robust than they're given credit for. I know my kids are, but my kids ask for boundaries, my teenagers. Everyone asks for boundaries. Now the question is, I've heard from Keith and from Graham how fantastic and liberating in so many ways, and I think they're great at doing this, can be. And these are really good points. But what's the proposition here? Do we have to throw away the good stuff if people start to assert their identity again and boundaries again, and maybe the state's part of that process? A lot of people think it isn't. It isn't. It doesn't mean having to throw away the good stuff. There's a lot of illegal things I can do. I think they're probably in Graham's book. I don't think it's my human right to keep doing them across boundaries. So really the kind of question is how much of the goods... I'm challenging this idea that we sort of, the internet disappears and all the good things about it stop if we start to sort of assert some more control. People start to assert more control.
I think there's two related and very good questions about, the brief point about Obama using data to get elected, and then the very, very good point about democracy being more than just you cast a vote and that's your political power, that it is actually about the process of forming your ideas and discussing and deciding who to vote for and arguing about policies and so on. And I think because this is something that I've looked at quite a lot, because I was quite concerned about the idea that one of the things that the digital technologies do is form our ideas in ways that we're not very aware of because of the kind of constant low-level nudging and feeding us things, not with malign intent, but just if your existence as a technology is premised on, we want to keep you here as long as possible and show you adverts, then we're going to show you what makes you excited or engaged, and if that ends up swaying you politically, that's not what we set out to do. But I actually think that is something that's very overplayed in terms of how much impact it has. And I'm glad you raised the Obama thing, because when everyone got very excited in 2016 and went, oh no, Facebook is telling us how to vote, or rather not us, obviously, Facebook is telling the other idiots how to vote, this has all gone horribly wrong. And I'm putting my hand up at this point and going, Well, you know, The Guardian, who are getting very worried about this, in 2008, in fact, you were running breathless pieces about how wonderful it is that Obama's using Facebook to get people to vote by somehow hoovering up all their contacts lists without them really knowing, and doing some really dodgy privacy invading stuff. But because it was Obama, everybody thought it was lovely. But I actually think that the impact of that is overstated, partly because we are not as susceptible on big issues as we are on small issues. I think if you're trying to sell me socks and I happen to be online and I see a nice picture of some socks, I'll probably buy the socks. You know, I don't have the bandwidth to argue about these things. But if you're trying to sell me someone who's going to govern my life for 4 years, I'm actually going to go out and do my own thinking and looking into things. And I think most of us do that. And the influence of data-driven internet campaigns is mainly about identifying who the people are that you need to campaign to because they are undecided, and identifying who the people are that are not undecided, but you need to make sure they come out and cast their vote, and pushing those people so they come out and cast their vote. And that is a digital version of the kind of persuasion and campaigning that politicians have always done. Now, we can certainly talk about whether the political campaigning we have is good campaigning and whether the politicians we have are good politicians, and I'm all up for that. But I do think the capacity of the internet and of technology to influence us in ways that are extraordinarily different from any previous campaign are usually overstated.
There's a theme here, which is we shouldn't try to make something only one thing. Facebook does a lot of bad things, censorship being, I think, the worst thing it does. It does some great things. WhatsApp is fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Free phone calls worldwide, anytime you want. Instant groups with your family, you know, organizing stuff. So unfortunately, we live in capitalism, and good things are usually owned by capitalists because that's how innovation happens. It doesn't mean they're bad things because they're owned by capitalists. They can still be good things. And Facebook's pretty global. 2.7 billion people every week use it. So it obviously has utility for people that makes their life easier and their life better. So you can honestly hate Mark Zuckerberg. He stole one of my ideas. I wrote a thing called What the Fuck Zuck. So I'm no friend of Zuckerberg, but I'm not going to deny that Facebook is responsible for some fantastic innovation. It really is. Nation states, same thing. You know, everything you get in life where you live comes through authorities that run your place, and you know, your life would be pretty bad without them. And you need political control over those things, and that's entirely true. But nation states also try to stop things. You know, the entire blockchain crypto world is trying to be regulated out of existence to protect banks and middlemen. You know, is that good? No, that's not good. So, freedom from regulation is often a really good human thing. So I think we shouldn't try to say this is only good or this is only bad. And that's true of the internet and the nation state. If you stand back and you look at history, the history of the human race is the history of greater and greater cooperation. More and more people being involved doing fewer and fewer things each to the greater good of everyone. And that is a global history. It's not a national history. Innovation doesn't exist nationally. It exists globally. It used to be national. Agricultural revolution was mainly Scottish. It used to be national, but now global innovation is normal, and national innovation is very rare. The COVID vaccine didn't happen in one country. It happened across scientists in many places. So I think we shouldn't be caricaturing pro-nation state or anti-internet or the other way around. We should have the nuance to understand there's a process of history here, and good stuff is coming out of technology and innovation.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay,
To respond to Andrew, so I think the question he was asking was, does getting rid of the bad stuff mean we have to get rid of the good stuff, or how much of the good stuff we're prepared to sacrifice. I think it's really important we understand that it's really difficult to draw a line between the good and the bad stuff, and the bad stuff that's bad enough that it should be suppressed. And we're kidding ourselves also if we think that technology can adequately distinguish between the others. And in the cross-border, in the cross-border context, sorry, one very important thing, don't forget different nation states have very different ideas about what is good and bad stuff, and in the cross-border context, that's really important.
Thank you, Graham. Okay, I'm going to go out for one more round.
Just a different aspect to the same question. Are we missing the class element to this? Because with the gentleman who spoke earlier about being able to work from wherever because he does his work in an international company, can be based wherever he wants to be based. Where things like wars happen, and Russia, as an example now of the tech elite, leaving the country within sort of a couple of weeks at the start of the war, is the real danger to the nation state that now they have a class of people, elite, who would in other circumstances be leading whatever fight their country needs to be fighting, suddenly getting up and leaving to wherever they need to go, and the poorer people who don't have that luxury, the people who are looking after your internet, staying and fighting the battle.
Timandra was talking about socks and what you can buy online and also what you can't buy online. So this idea of identifying with the state, wanting to debate, wanting to be part of politics. During lockdown, I'm a university lecturer, so during lockdown I found myself teaching a lot online, and I kept wondering when my students and my colleagues were going to say, stop this nonsense, it's really bad, it's not working, we hate it. But nobody did. And I was rather depressed by the way that students adapted to this, as if teaching was just something transactional. You went online, you went onto the Zoom call, you looked at your screen. Is that all my teaching was worth? And when I said to my colleagues, why aren't we demanding better technology for this kind of online teaching? They said, oh, well, it will all be over in a few weeks. So there wasn't, any need to kind of press for anything better. So it's this transactional thing. And in the end, we won't have a choice. We'll be told your university is a Zoom call and that's all you can have. So do we need to make that more embodied, or do we accept the idea it's just transfer of information through a screen?
I'm glad that you brought up the online safety bill earlier. I know that's the UK government's trying to pass that. In my opinion, that's a really horrible thing. I hope it doesn't pass. But also, if this does pass, how realistic is it that this will actually stop people from expressing themselves online via getting around? If Chinese people can get around VPNs, they can surely get around something devised by Nadine Dorries. But I guess my point is so what role could or should the state be? I don't think that things could be left entirely to private companies, given the fact that a whole bunch of these companies have really facilitated a lot of content that we probably would not want our kids to be looking at. So I guess I have the question, this is the 100th anniversary of the BBC. If the state is to play a role at all, should it be to try hopelessly to regulate the existing content online, or should it provide an alternative space for debate, discussion, and content for people in that way, as opposed to try to clamp down on something that appears to be unregulatable?
Thank you. Great. So we've got a few minutes left for summing up. I think, if the state's to be involved at all, what role should they play to hold big tech to account? Or should we, in other ways, be holding big tech to account, given the importance they play in our lives? I'm going to ask for the opposite summing up to start with Andrew.
Yeah, I'm surprised nobody mentioned social credit, China's social credit system, because it could have fitted into sort of 2 or 3 or 4 strands that we're having. I'm always an optimist, but I think we'll have something very similar here, probably presented as a kind of incentive for people who cut their carbon emissions. Can't wait. But that's something that wouldn't be possible. That's a kind of a form of social coercion, rather heavier than nudge, that wouldn't be possible without network technologies. Just returning to a small point on tax, if we, maybe it's irrelevant, sorry, but if cryptocurrencies take off, and I don't see that happening now because we're in this terrible crash, everyone's reeling, punch drunk, then it would be almost impossible to tax personal gains, never mind the companies. I think that's more or less what we've got. I used to come here for many years, and there was a great screeching of brakes after Donald Trump was elected, and it was almost like the utopians were aghast and said the tools that we thought only good people would use, we're horrified to discover that bad people are using them too. So I think I'll just return to my kind of first point, which is that how do you begin to reclaim the relationship that truly matters is between the individual and the state over here, the companies over here. Are social conservatives going to have the monopoly on how this is defined? Because going forward, it looks like they have. The arguments and the popular support, I don't think the individual belongs to any corner of the spectrum, part of the political divide. I think the individual on which the Enlightenment belongs to us all. And we should start asserting that much more strongly, not only against the state, but against technology monopolies too.
Thank you, Andrew. Graham, go ahead. You've got 1 minute.
Okay. I was interested in the reference to the BBC. I may be completely wrong on this, but if I remember right, the motto of the BBC was "And nation shall speak unto nation," a very state-oriented, monopolistic view of things. We're in the era where individuals can speak to individuals across borders and to the world. And does that mean that the internet is unregulatable? I would strongly push back on that. Talk to the people languishing in prison through having committed Communications Act type offences throughout the Britain and tell them that it's unregulatable. What I do think is that there is a vacuum, and there's a vacuum in access to justice, in that where do you go to complain? The police often don't do anything. They treat offline threats much more seriously and responsibly than online threats, for instance. And where do you go? You're left going to a company in California. And I would think that a lot of the move now to instrumentalize the power of the intermediaries in this cause has come through that vacuum, which has been created by, I think, a lack of engagement by the state in the role it should be playing in the enforcement of laws online.
Thank you. Keith.
Firstly, I just want to be saying I'm so glad that Andrew is an optimist. I didn't realize that until he said so.
Well, I mean, I think we can do much better than today's internet.
Jobs and teaching is kind of interesting because it takes us to where the internet's going. You've probably all heard of DALL-E, this AI that can make pictures from words and soon videos from words, and GPT-3, which can write stories from inputs. Not to talk about all the YouTube channels that teach math to American high schoolers. It feels to me as if we should be yearning for the end of teaching and its replacement by teaching, but not by humans. Because most teaching is the repetition of known knowledge to people in a way they can digest. And different kids have different ways of digesting. I have 3 boys. They're so different. They need different things. The internet can do what a teacher can't, which is cater to each one of them. And, I think teaching jobs will be some of the later ones to go. Self-driving vehicles connected to the internet are going to mean that delivery, look at an Amazon warehouse, there's hardly a person in it these days. This is progress. Why? Because it gives humans freedom through time to do other stuff that machines can take over from. And the other stuff is way more valuable because machines can't do it. That's what humans are especially good at. I'll finish on this, there's a really great article by Barry Weiss called "DALL-E Can't Make Art." And she makes a great point. DALL-E can make pictures, but only from sources that already exist. Humans can imagine things that don't exist and make them. So the space for humanity is the space beyond the internet, beyond machines, and the internet's going to make that possible if we embrace it and go with it. If we resist it, then of course we'll be like Luddites and we'll stay in the dark ages.
Thanks, Keith. And Timandra. Your final remarks.
I want to briefly respond to your point on teaching, because I've been doing a part-time philosophy master's at Birkbeck, most of which has been online, to the great frustration of most of the students and most of the philosophy teachers, I have to say. But talking to the lecturers about the structure of the university, it's pretty clear that university degrees were already a transaction rather than a teaching relationship. So like a lot of these things, I think the problem is not the technology. The technology enabled them to move online, but it was already content provision. But what I really wanted to finish on is I love lots of things that have come out of Silicon Valley, and one of the things I love is Oakland Privacy Commission, which I'm sure you're aware of, started as a citizens' campaign against Oakland City Council's proposal to bring in a very high-tech surveillance system that would recognize number plates, faces, sounds, all sorts of things. And the citizens said, well, hang on, where's your privacy policy to govern all of this technology you want to introduce? And the city council went, look, we're getting federal money for this, be quiet. And then the campaign went on, engaged with the elected representatives, and finished up being a commission that sits in the City Hall, Oakland, once a month or so, and actually has the job of drafting the laws that will govern any new technology that the city wants to bring in. So it is literally a layer of accountability which involves some local citizens, some civil liberties groups, and holds to account the state's use of technology, essentially. And I sat in on a meeting. It was like the police came in. It was a very collegiate atmosphere. The people on the commission saying, look, we understand why you sent the drone into the house before you sent the policeman, because of this terrible case where there's several police got shot, but you must understand that you did not stick to what we had agreed was a suitable regulation for your use of drones. And so, we're going to have to complain about this. And that really, for me, pinned down the importance here is that we have to get involved here. We have to get stuck in and hold to account the people who use technology in ways that gives them power over us. And often those are supposedly our electoral representatives. The problem is not the people sitting in Silicon Valley going, oh, look, hey, we've invented this great thing. Let's see what we can do with it. The problem is where we are in relationships where people have power over us and institutions have power over us. And the only answer to that really is that we have to step up and find ways to hold them to account.
Thank you. Let's give a round of applause to all of our speakers and all of you for your questions.